question number 2 here that will actually direct the rest of the conversation today, because we're going to talk about emotions. And that was a question asked, or not necessarily a question, more of an experience by Hirsch. Hirsch, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. How's it going?
Good, good. What about you?
Not bad.
Cool. So I've kind of tried to summarize how you described your experience, and you can tell me if that's actually a good representation of what you were experiencing. So you were talking how making mistakes is often the downfall of your game. You talked also about how personal mistakes are the ones that typically eat you alive, and I think you're not the only one in that situation. And you kind of described the cycle that happens when you're playing, where you make a mistake, the mistake tilts you, and so it leads to you maybe spewing some money, and then you realize you've made a mistake at some point, and you try to overcompensate by playing more conservatively. And depending on the intensity of the mistake, maybe that will continue outside of the tables or even the next day. So that's what I kind of got from the experience you described in Discord. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's along the lines of kind of the way it goes, but it's more because if a spot is like unknown to me, so like obviously like I'm more on the new side to online poker and multi-tabling and all that kind of stuff, and and I'm very recreational, right? So this is like not my full-time gig.
Mm-hmm.
I have a full-time job that takes up probably 50 to 80 hours a week of my time. So when I
Mm-hmm.
do play, I try to play, as optimal as I can. But the issue for me is when I'm stuck in a spot and I don't know what to do, I'll mark the hand, that's fine. But if I make a mistake that I probably know is the wrong move, I'll kind of, beat myself over the head with it. And I
Mm-hmm.
know we should be kind to ourselves, but at the same time, it's like, if you have a gut feeling or you have some sort of general idea of what you should or should not do, and you end up doing it anyways, that's what kind of pushes me off the edge.
Mm-hmm.
And so I usually realize a mistake probably the hand after. And then once
Okay.
I realize that, I kind of like slow down because I'm like, okay, well, I lost 30 big blinds, so let's just let's play a little more conservatively, and then I end up not playing GTR or something, and it kind of goes downhill from there. And then that type of mentality kind of flows into the next tournament I play or not. So um, it's yeah, it's not more of like the runouts, the cards, and that kind of stuff is kind of second nature to me. It is what it is. It's something I can't control. It's out of my control. But the things that are within my control are the kind of things that kind of put me over the cliff.
Uh-huh.
I know, and I think where I was going with that was, well, everyone has all these different mechanisms of trying to kind of curb these spewy moments, I guess.
Uh-huh.
They'll say, I meditate, take deep breaths, and I think the I've done things I think we've all done things over the years where we're like, okay, well, what can help me kind of balance my mind or kind of keep myself focused, or some people run, or work out or do whatever, right? But
Mm-hmm.
these things often, myself most of the time is like a 15-day things, right? So we do them, we're really intense about them, and then all
Yeah.
of a sudden they kind of
Mm-hmm.
drop off because we don't have that mental discipline or mental fortitude to kind of keep yourself within that routine.
Mm-hmm.
And so after you start doing something new and it kind of helps, you kind of revert back to your old self when you do something that's not optimal. So I think for me, the question's always been, so what can we do to keep ourselves, between the lines, essentially,
Yeah. Yeah.
without having this weird graph of where we go, where we're doing good things, and then we just have this massive downfall, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And yeah, try to summarize and make sure I understand what you're talking about. And also just when you explain how you try a new habit or you develop a new strategy to try to help you cope better, for example, or you gave the example of meditation and cold showers. And sometimes what's lacking is the why behind the activity you're doing. So yeah, you know, what you're doing meditation or cold showers, but what's lacking is why you're doing the thing in the first place. We're not necessarily understanding why those activities or strategies are useful, and sometimes this is what's lacking, and this is what makes you stop after 10 or 15 days, because you don't have the purpose behind the action. Does that
Right.
make
And
sense?
so like when you have like linear things, right? Like when you work out, right? You say,
Mm-hmm.
even though you can never really track whether you're getting, whether you're actually fit or not, right? You feel better each day, right? You have like
Yep.
you
Mm-hmm.
know that you're making improvements. You can't really quantify it, but you know you're making improvements, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
meditation, I've had or deep breathing, whatever it may be, like you feel better in the moment, but there's not really a way to say like, hey, I'm feeling better every day in my mind, right?
Yeah,
It's just
yeah, for sure.
more of like a temporary thing in time.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's always been the thing for me. It's like
Okay.
the things in my life that have always been consistent, right, are the ones that I put where I know the purpose of doing something. And
Yeah.
so
Mm-hmm.
that's why often, I know a lot of people I know that you jump on and off think because often there's no real passion or understanding there.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, okay, I like where you're going with this in terms of uh, let's say you do meditation, you don't necessarily, yeah, maybe you feel good in the moment, but you don't necessarily see the benefits adding up. And I think this closely ties down to what kind of expectations you have for an activity. Because let's say I tell you, you do meditation for 5 or 10 minutes every day, you have no expectations at all. Maybe at least in those situations, you won't be disappointed, or you won't feel like it's not useful because you haven't created any expectations for a situation. And we'll go into this a bit deeper, but before that, I just wanted to address that first question about how we might want to compartmentalize or ignore the moments that lead us to those vicious cycles. And I think the answer is there's no really good way to do it. And actually, what's the best way to do it is to observe the situation when it happens, accept it as it is, because most of the time you can't change that situation. And then we can actually find something more productive, a better action or reaction to that situation. And I have maybe a question for you to clarify things before we move forward. When you say the mistake tilts me and then it leads to spewy moments, could you describe what's going on through your mind in that moment? Like, is the spewy moments, are they used as a way to, I guess, win back the money that you've lost by making that mistakes? Is that the logical or the rational thing behind those behaviors?
Uh, it's it's a action without thought. Is probably the best way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's I do something with no reasoning behind it. I just do it because I'm not thinking straight, right? So like
Mm-hmm.
I'll overplay something that shouldn't be overplayed, right? So like I'll
Yeah.
have like, let's just say I'll have like ace king on like an ace queen jack, ace queen jack board, and the guy has a VPIP of like 5%, and I'll still try to um in my mind think that I had the best hand, right? So
Right.
this is just, and we know that in the situation, people with low VPIPs, raising from EP and re-raising you on flops, you know you're never good, right? You should just
Yeah,
probably
for sure.
just overfold in these spots, and it's just something that you should never really be going through with. But in my mind, when I've made a mistake, I often do things without thinking. Very reactionary, very
Yeah.
yeah, reflex, I
Yeah,
guess.
reflexes. Nice. Okay.
Yeah.
I think you gave me, or you gave us enough information. I think we can move on to this, because this is how we're going to try to understand your situation. Okay, and maybe this looks a bit overwhelming at first. I'll try to break it down so that it actually becomes something understandable for everyone here. So does that sound good? I imagine it does. Okay, cool. All right, so I'll try to make sense of this, help you understand it better. And so what we have here is basically a model that explains how our emotional system inside of us work. and how basically we try to solve for the situations in our life where we're having a challenge of some sort, maybe a stimulus that might be dangerous, like all those kind of things, and even situation where you're on tilt, for example, or when you're making a mistake. I think making a mistake is a great example. So before giving an example specific to poker, I'll try to give an example very broad so that we can understand it quite simply just by talking about it. So here, the stimulus representation is basically what's happening. And the simplest example I could give you is, let's say you're going on a hike and you come up face to face with a bear. The stimulus in that situation is the bear appearing in front of you, for example. And so how your body, your brain makes sense of that situation is twofold. So it goes in two directions at the same time, trying to find a solution to the problem in front of you. So the solution here, or the problem here, is the bear that might eat you alive right in front of you. And if I bring your attention to the bottom side of the model here, what's going on is you have some expectations about the world, so knowledge, past experiences. And so in this situation, for example, yeah, you might expect the bear to come up, but you don't expect the bear to appear in that specific moment. So that leads to a mismatch between your expectations and what's going on, basically a bear appearing in front of you. And in those situations, you'll try to find a response that will solve for the mismatch, right? So now there's a bear in front of you. What do I do in that situation to solve the problem? And typically what people would do would they would start running, right? But imagine that this is the very first time you see a bear, so you've never learned the behavior of running away when you see a bear. You'd look at the top side of the model. So you'd have your emotional system with arousal and valence, so basically telling you when something's important and dangerous. And this thing basically is always running, because the emotional system is something that helps you see danger, and basically this is what's keeping you alive. And so what happens in that situation, let's say you don't have an accurate response yet to solve the problem, the emotional system is in place, and basically an emotion, you start feeling a certain emotion. What kind of emotion do you think you feel when you see a bear in the forest? Like, I think the answer is quite obvious, but I'll give you still a second to think about it. Yeah, fear, obviously. So you have the emotion, I won't write that down because my writing won't be good. You have an emotion of fear that creates some emotional tension in your body. And that emotional tension is telling you, this is something critical. Maybe I need to pay attention to what's going on. And so what happens in that situation is the stimulus, the bear, takes all the attention so that you can actually figure out a response. So all the other stimuli no longer matter in that moment. So let's say you were checking your phone, you were singing, you were talking, everything is stopped because all your attention, yeah, tunnel vision, but this is good tunnel vision, right? There is a danger in front of us. I need to use all my cognitive power or resources to find a response. And hopefully the response will be good enough to inhibit the emotion. And so once my brain has thought about the situation, it's like, maybe I should run away. The response is probably effective enough that once you've run for a couple of I was going to say miles, maybe you don't have to go that far, but once you've run far enough, the response becomes effective. It inhibits the emotional system, so you no longer feel the emotion of fear, and you no longer feel the emotional tension. Does that make sense? Yeah, I see a couple of yes. So we have a system here that is always active, and we have here a system where, based on our own expectation, we can find a situation where we might be in danger because there's a mismatch between our expectation and what's going on. Okay, so now how can we make this relatable to Hirsch's experience? Let's try to break it down by the step-by-step with the cycle he described earlier. So first thing that happens is he makes a mistake. So that's the stimulus going on in that situation. And in a situation like this, like you said earlier, my expectation is that I know enough about the spot that I won't make a mistake. So what happens in that situation? Would you agree that there's a mismatch between the stimulus, you've made a mistake, and the expectation? The expectation is that you won't make a mistake. And because there's a mismatch, it triggers your desire to find an accurate response in that situation. And my guess, because the point number 2 you said is the mistake creates tilt, which lead to spewing moments. So this is kind of something that is unconscious. So your first initial response here to trying to alleviate the situation is, let's overplay some hands, maybe be more aggressive, because that means maybe I'll win my money back. So that's kind of the first part of the model here. We have an expectation that is not matching with the situation, so we need to find a response to solve the situation. And so what you'll realize is that playing more aggressively actually does not work to inhibit the emotional response. Because what happens right after that is your emotional system gets triggered. And so you said it, I realize I made a mistake, and I try to overcompensate by playing more conservatively. So here the emotion, you have the tilt that is still present. It creates emotional tension in your body. It also creates a priority, so it becomes part of your attentional system. So when you said, I realize I've made a mistake, this is now what's brought up in your attention. And so your brain is like, let's find a solution to that problem. And what solution you try this time, what response you try to do, you start playing more conservatively. And so what happens when you play more conservatively? At least you probably reduce the amount of money you might lose. So what happens in that situation is you might be able to inhibit the tilt and the emotional tension by playing more conservative. But what you might realize is maybe the solution is not good enough to alleviate the tilt, and maybe the tilt will stay after your session or even the next day. Let me read some of the comments now. Yeah, so one of the, maybe a solution here that was proposed is to create some system for taking some time before acting and making decisions in game. So basically what you're telling me here is, let's try to create a window where we can decide not to act on our emotions and actually take some time just to get some perspective and not act on the emotion, but act rationally or making better decisions. Yeah, and then if we made a mistake and we didn't know any better, we have to let ourselves make mistakes. So I think everything you've just mentioned actually fits with what we're going to see next. So basically, we're going to try to provide solutions here.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just like, I also like, I'm a little OCD when it comes to everything that I do in my life. So like often my mistakes are quite amplified. And I think most of the time I'm using the way I play my game is that, I'll have a certain amount of seconds I'll let drop in my time bank before I make a decision anyways, to allow myself to make the right decision. But it's when I get the tunnel vision, I think for me is finding a way to kind of break the loop before I get the tunnel vision, or before I get the blackout, essentially.
Yeah, because as soon as you get in the tunnel vision, you're in that section here, and you're just trying to deal with that tilt situation, and maybe you don't have to act on that tilt at all, because what you described me is basically this emotional tension that you have when you're maybe making a mistake and you start tilting. And basically I had a question for everyone here. Maybe I gave an answer already. I see 3 areas where we could potentially work on in this model to help someone in your situation feel better. And you gave some examples. So can you find or name the words or the places where you would modify or try to find a better way to cope with the situation? Like I see 3 places that we can actually have some impact or agency to not let necessarily the emotion take over, for example. Like what would you do? What would you use in that model? What would you change in that model in terms of what would you work on? Yeah. And so this is a question for everybody. So maybe you want to write in the chat some of the words from the model that you think would be a place where we could work on. Expectation. Awesome. That's 1. We're missing 2. Stress. I think the stress response, okay. Yeah, that was the second one. So stress. So yeah, there's something here, but it's, if you look at the model, you can only inhibit what comes afterwards. So technically this is always present in your brain, but sometimes since you have some response that are, yeah, emotional tension, awesome. So we have 3 variables now, and this is what we're gonna here try to explain further or at least find solutions. All right, so let's move back to your question. And so the solutions. I see the time now, it's been almost 50 minutes right now. You guys still want to stay in because it might take another 15, 20 minutes, or do you want us to continue next week? I don't know. What do you guys think? Keep going. Keep on. Nice. So first solution. Let me bring it forward. Acting on the stimulus. So here we're talking about working with the response. So we have a stimulus. What's an appropriate, effective response to the situation? So for the example of the bear earlier, it's basically flight. So leaving the situation as fast as possible. But like I wrote here, oftentimes, if you act on the stimulus, like making a mistake or the anger, the emotion you're feeling, it oftentimes leads to unproductive reactions. So we end up in situation where we become maybe impulsive, because that's the only way we've found of trying to resolve the emotional tension. And so some of the examples would be, like you said earlier, maybe you start playing more aggressively when losing money or when making mistakes, because that's basically our response to win some money back. Does that make sense? It seems quite logical to me to try to play more aggressively or try to overplay some hands because I'm trying to win the money that I've lost. So I think the logic makes sense, even though it's not necessarily rational. Another example I see often is you stop playing. Oops. You stop playing because you fear you're going to lose money. Or let's say more money. And so stop playing is actually a great response to stop losing money. You're no longer playing. You don't put yourself in a situation that might be dangerous. Yeah, taking the more simple approach in difficult situation, because you know that a mistake might be minus EV. So maybe you're going to play more ABC, but maybe that's not the optimal solution. And so stop playing or playing more aggressively. Stop playing. Yeah, I see the comment. Stop playing, go to sleep, practice in the morning, and you'll have much better session the next day. It might be a good response short term, but it's not sustainable long term if you're playing poker professionally on a full-time basis, if you stop playing every time you're having a bad session. So what would be useful reactions in those moments? Like what would be useful response or when we experience some fear, some anger, so I'm thinking about tilt. Fear, anger. I guess let's keep it to these two. Like we've talked about this already. So what are those actions that we can take in that moment that would be better actions than stop playing or starting to play more aggressively to win your money back? Try to play a little better than the last time you had the feeling. Yep. Playing better. So playing better, that means, I guess, focusing on your decision making. That I think that's my definition of playing better. Yeah, reduce volume to make it more easy to focus. I think that's a good might be a better solution. So reducing the volume of tournaments you're playing. So instead of stopping to play completely, maybe you just reduce the volume. The execution of your skills. So focusing on making, it's the same thing as focusing on making making the best decision possible. And there's actually one of them that was not mentioned that I'll throw in there, which is not acting on it. So even though you have this stimulus, you've made a mistake, it creates some anger and tilt. Who's telling us that we actually have to act on that stimulus? Why should we act on the stimulus? Yeah, recognizing the feeling. So you recognize a feeling, but do you actually need to act on it? Because when you face a bear and you have this emotion of fear, it makes sense to act on that stimulus and run away because you're going to die if you don't. But in a situation where you're playing poker and you're making a mistake, do you actually have to act on the emotion of tilt, anger, and try to win more money or win your money back? You don't have to act on that emotion. So what we understand from this first solution about like focusing, identifying without acting, that's part of meditation as well. So we'll talk about this a bit further later. So one of the solutions is acting on the stimulus or finding an appropriate response. So refocusing on your decision-making abilities, focusing on executing your skills, maybe reducing the volume of tables or tournaments you're playing. But sometimes the solution is to simply not act on that emotion. It's not that intuitive because we're an evolutionary creature and we've learned that we need to act on the emotional tension that we're experiencing or on the stimulus that is present. So that was solution number one, right? So trying to find an appropriate response in those solutions. Solution number two, acting on the reference model. So that's the expectations that we've mentioned earlier. And I wrote this here, that's work that can be done outside the table. So that's awesome because here, acting on the stimulus, typically this is something that will happen when playing. But something that you can do before playing is to manage your expectations or create realistic expectations. So what we're going to do here is we're going to modify our expectation regarding a certain stimulus. So the stimulus here could be making a mistake. So if your expectation is that you won't make mistakes, then of course there will be a mismatch when you make a mistake. And so we can do actually two things when we manage expectations. One of them is to modify the expectation to exactly match the stimulus. What does that mean? That basically means that if mistakes are part of poker, then my expectations are that I'll make mistakes. So in the future, if this expectation becomes integrated, there will no longer be a mismatch between the situation and your expectation. So you won't even feel a need to respond because there won't be any emotion present. You won't feel the anger or tilt because your expectation are matching the situation. You're making a mistakes. You're making mistakes, and that's okay. So what I'm talking about here is acceptance. And I guess a funny example in the article I was reading about this theory or model is this one: accepting death as an inevitable and unpredictable fact of life. So we could actually change two words here: accepting mistakes as an inevitable and unpredictable fact of poker. Maybe you could even change mistakes for variance. This is our new expectation. And so just by modifying our expectation here, we change the way we're going to react to those situations in the future. Yeah, being grateful. Lara, you're already taking a step ahead here. So being grateful for recognizing mistakes as they are learning opportunities. So watching high-level pros making mistakes and being okay with that really helps. So yeah, watching people make mistakes, making mistakes yourself, but reframing how we're going to approach those situations. And that was actually my second suggestion for how we can manage our expectations. So we're going to create a new concept and find a new relationship to expand the expectations. So that's what we call reappraisal or reframing. So if I take the example earlier about death, we see the inevitability and unpredictability of death as elements that make life today, in the moment, something valuable, exceptional, and worthy of being enjoyed. And so similarly, here we could say the inevitability of mistakes or variance are elements that make poker, I guess, a beautiful game. I'm trying to see if that's going to be convincing enough for you guys. In fact, how about let's look at variance for a moment. What would be one way to reframe variance in something positive or helpful? Like instead of thinking of variance as something that makes us run bad, that is annoying, that is stressful because we're supposed to win because we're good. How would you reframe variance in a good way? So sometimes we get lucky and win a lot of money. Wow, there you go. Sometimes we get, without variance, bad players will never win. It's literally what makes the game profitable. No recreational without luck. And also you could just change your perspective and think about how it's part of everything, even life. So variance is part of life as well. But I really love how we can make this tangible and specific to poker. So without variance, bad players would never win. It's what makes the game profitable for us. There would be no wreck players without luck. That's how you reframe or you change your appraisal or your expectation of a situation. So now we no longer see variance as something bad. We actually are grateful for variance to be present in poker because we wouldn't be here playing poker professionally without variance. So thank you, variance. And thank you, mistakes, because basically mistakes are opportunities to learn, grow, improve on our game. Because yes, I imagine all of you here want to make money, want to be profitable poker players, but I'm pretty sure you also enjoy seeing yourself progress and make improvement on your game. So thank you, mistakes, for showing us when we're making mistakes and where we can actually put more work and get better. Now, last but not least, and then I'll let you go with your day. Third solution, if you remember, we talked about how we can find an appropriate response, and now we talked about how we can change our expectations. Last but not least is how is acting on functional elements of the system, meaning basically acting on the emotional tension. And so this is where it becomes interesting, and it kind of ties down to what we spoke about earlier about how we don't necessarily have to act or find an appropriate response to the stressful situation, the stimulus. Maybe we could just try to reduce the emotional tension that is created by the situation. And so this is something we call silencing the somatic experience. So somatic is the body, basically. And so we could silence or at least diminish or manage the somatic experience of the emotional response. So basically, when we feel the emotional tension of fear or anger, like anger, you probably start to feel hot, your hands might be sweating, you feel the adrenaline, maybe you feel like your muscle or you feel some muscle tension, right? When you're angry, or even when you're scared or anxious. So your body gets activated. And how about instead of acting on that activation, we try to reduce our body activation. So we're trying to reduce the emotional tension. So what happens if there's no emotional tension? If there's no emotional tension in our body, we don't have to act on anything. Because that's the signal that our body is sending us to act on something dangerous, something that makes us angry. So no emotional tension, no need to act on anything because everything's perfect. And so some not productive or useful strategies that I see maybe too often in poker, that they actually work in the short term, but I don't recommend it, drugs or alcohol. So sometimes maybe you feel angry and you don't know how to manage the emotion. So maybe you'll grab a drink that will help you relax, but that's not a sustainable strategy for many reasons. We won't get into it. So what are those more productive, useful strategies? And so this is where your question from earlier, Hirsch, I don't know if you're still with us. We're asking like, what are we mitigating by practicing meditation or cold showers or even other activities like breathing? We're actually acting on the emotional tension. So meditation, cold showers, breathing, those are activities that could help you mitigate the emotional tension. With meditation, maybe you sit with the emotion until it goes away on its own. So you observe the emotion and you let it go. With cold showers, you learn that even if you put yourself in a situation that brings anxiety, the cold shower, you don't have to act on the situation and leave the shower. So by staying in a cold shower, you train yourself to not act on a challenging stimulus. You challenge yourself not to act on your emotional tension. And you can use breathing as a way to reduce the emotional tension, which has been proven to be very successful at. So that's all I had for you today. We're already 12:30, so basically an hour and a couple of minutes we've done today. So I hope this helped, Hirsch, in your own experience, but also for other people here. Nice. And let me give you, I guess, another challenge for this week. The challenge will be following. You're going to pick a situation or stimulus that triggers you. Could be a mistake, variance, something else in your life. You choose one of the 3 cognitive strategies. So either you find an appropriate response for the situation, either you change or reframe your expectations of the situation, or you find a way to reduce the emotional tension. So that's one of the 3 cognitive strategies. And then you're going to explain how you will use the cognitive strategy to resolve the situation. So how are you going to use that strategy to change the situation, or at least solve the situation? So if you guys are willing to do so, you could probably post your answers in the Mental Game Discord chat.